Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I've read a lot of books in my life, but there are relatively few books that have really challenged my worldview and encouraged me to think about things differently, think about the big questions of who we are and where we've come from in a way that forces me to reshape my beliefs into something else. But one of those books undoubtedly is Dominion by Tom Holland, which I've just finished reading. And so tonight, it's a very thick book. Tonight I want to just go through some of the highlights of that book and some of the big questions it throws up about the development of the Western mind, about the development of what we today would say is secular humanist society from Christian morality, and just how deeply the teachings of Christ have influenced Western society and ultimately the world over the past 2,000 years. And this book is great because it challenged my assumptions about Christianity. It also challenged many of my assumptions about modernity and to what extent either of those things are a force for good or evil in the world. I'm going to explore the fascinating content and the fascinating ideas that are laid out in Tom Holland's book, the highlights as far as I'm concerned. And maybe by watching this video, you too, like I was, will be challenged in your thinking about religion, about spirituality, about the traditions of the past and what role they have played in our world and what role they may or may not continue to play into the future, and whether or not that's ultimately a good thing. So Dominion spans millennia worth of time. It goes through the rise and fall of great empires, and it goes through the history of the church and other forms of religion that were ultimately supplanted by the church. It begins by looking at the Persian Empire and then the empires that succeeded it in the form of ancient Greece and Rome and the European powers of the medieval era. And the starting point of the book in Persia is looking at the first concept that societies had around this sort of God or this divine force who is responsible for justice among people and is responsible for maintaining order, as was embodied in the ancient Persian religion. But of course, this was before we had a Judeo-Christian morality as we know it. So the kind of order that was upheld by the gods back in those pre-Christian, pre-Judean times, it was quite cruel compared to what we would consider to be a just order today. It was extremely hierarchical, extremely stratified. There was a powerful ruling class at the top of society, and order meant maintaining their position, no matter how cruelly or how unfairly their subjects would be treated in comparison to them, because hierarchy was seen as good. It was seen as the very epitome of order, with no mercy or no compassion even factoring into it. And this was carried through to the Greek civilization. Even though we attribute democracy and other nice ideas to the Greeks, it was still very much a hierarchical society where there were slaves and rigid stratification within society where a lot of people were treated unfairly. And the gods of the Greeks were capricious and really immoral by today's standards. But piece by piece, as the early civilizations went along, they started to ask the question, should there be a lovingness in the just order of the divine? And this would be a question which the religions of the Judeo-Christian tradition would begin to answer as they formulated their own unique worldview around the divine, around humanity, our place in the universe, and our relationship to the divine, our relationship to God. The book talks about the emergence of the ancient Hebrew or Israelite forms of religion, and how little by little a new idea of God began to emerge, and a new form of religion surrounding that God, which was unprecedented in history, began to emerge. There is a set of characteristics of ancient Israelite religion which, taken together, make the phenomenon of that religion utterly unique. Belief in just one God, belief in a kind of a universalism, that the faith of the one God would one day be for all people, not just one group of people or one ethnicity. And it was a God who felt compassion for those who were poor, those who were oppressed, those who suffered, as opposed to the previous gods of the ancient world who were very much associated with might. And the mighty were favoured by the gods, and all who were wretched were not to be spared. In the form of the God of the Exodus now, we had a God who was actually siding with those who cried out for justice, who were the most disadvantaged. And now, at last, we had a God as well who was not distant, did not keep the people, the subjects of that God, at arm's length, but through successive covenants, we had a God that wanted to have a personal relationship with his followers, the way that a father might want to have relationships with his children. Very different to the distant and very alienated gods of the past before that point. And we have a God who seems interested in the dignity of the human person, that each person has inherent dignity, and that each person can be regarded as having something of a reflection of the divine in themselves. And although it was the Greeks or the Stoics who came up with the idea of conscience, we can see echoes of something like conscience even in Israelite religion, as this new monotheism was starting to take shape. And this was the religion, this was the form of morality. This was the kind of belief system which was prophesied to Abraham to bring blessing to the whole world through some mysterious means, and indeed it has come to pass. As we see the rest of the history of the rest of the world, but particularly the West, throughout the rest of Tom Holland's book. And so the first thing that Dominion did was it made me question one key assumption that I had had about the religions of the world. I previously believed that all of the great religions of the world were more or less the same. They were different culturally, and they were different in terms of the specific rituals or the specific texts that they had. But fundamentally, at their core, they were the same. And I think this is true to a certain extent, but I do think that there are things about certain religions that makes them unique. And monotheism, as expressed first in ancient Israelite religion and then later in Christianity, is something which is unique like no other. Because for the first time, I think, compared to the other religions that have existed, we have this worldview that is universal, that emphasizes compassion, but more than that, it actually emphasizes the need to change the world for the better, for history to move forward, to unfold into a better form that better glorifies the God who is loving. And that is something that is utterly unique about the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I think it should be treated as something that is very special, because without it, human history would look very different. And that is something that I've come to really appreciate about the Judeo-Christian spiritual tradition as a result of reading this book. We make all sorts of assumptions about what the past was like, but by looking at the historical record, Holland is really able to show just how inhumane society was before Judeo-Christian morality became the norm in the West. And it really makes you appreciate what a unique influence particularly Christianity has had as it spread around the world. Because really, we have these ideas beginning to emerge in what would become Judaism, but it's really with the advent of Christianity, and particularly with the ministry of St. Paul, that we see those ideas being revolutionized once again, taking on a more revolutionary form, and being spread far and wide as the gates are opened to the ministry to the Gentiles. And that is what has allowed these ideas to spread to the rest of the West. Holland then grapples with some of the early debates within the early church, some of which are theological or moral issues that we're still debating about to this day, which still reverberate into the modern day. So there were debates between the likes of Basil and Gregory about wealth, about extravagant material wealth, and to what extent it was a sin simply to have more than you needed. Or perhaps material wealth was okay, but it depended on how you use it, as asserted by Paulinus. And then, of course, you have the complete inversion of the idea that wealth and opulence is incompatible with following in the footsteps of the Christ in the form of the absolute decadence of the Vatican and of the Catholic Church. And all of these different thinkers were trying to some extent grapple with the words of Christ in the Gospels about the camel trying to move through the eye of a needle, the story of Lazarus, the story of Christ telling the rich man to give all his belongings away. And even to this day, there are questions around the distribution of wealth, around the gap between rich and poor, around how we should approach the question of poverty, which we've been debating about for the last 2,000 years, it turns out. There is a chapter about Charlemagne spreading Christianity through the sword for the first time, and arguably, and setting a precedent of conversion through violence with his brutal attacks on the Saxons, and how that was such a shocking thing in the Christian world at the time, because before then it was taken for granted by certain figures that Christianity must be spread peacefully, because of course Christ was the Prince of Peace, and to minister and to evangelize was to spread the faith peacefully, and how this started a debate about whether it is right for Christianity to be spread by the sword, particularly when religion should be a matter of conscience only and not external force upon a person, compelling them to a certain belief. And of course there is the evolution of ideas about the separation between church and state. And it also turns out that there's a lot of things that Christianity is ultimately responsible for that it doesn't get a lot of credit for in modern times. I can't imagine why. But Holland highlights some of these things that ultimately stem from Christianity, such as the idea of human rights, which was developed by Catholic priests in the New World in South America, who were trying to grapple with some of the atrocities that were being perpetrated by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and how that was compatible with the Christian view of compassion and the dignity of human beings, even those who held heathen beliefs. The idea of freedom of conscience as to personal religious beliefs, is something that ultimately comes from Christianity, was particularly emphasized in the Protestant churches. There's also a role that the church had to play in the promotion of science. We often think of the church today as being anti-science, and there are many creationists around today who would only reinforce that impression. But in fact, Holland covers the journeying of the Jesuits to China in order to help with the calculation of the eclipses in the sky, using their astronomical knowledge. And it talks about how the Jesuits and many within the church were ardent supporters of science, because they saw in science a chance to understand the mechanics of God's will in the created universe. It was a way of understanding God by observing the physical world. And this is not the view that you get today. You get the stereotypical story about Galileo locked away because the church was afraid of science. Holland talks about the case of Galileo as well, and how it was more about a clash of egos between Galileo and some of the clergy than it was about a particular scientific theory being any kind of threat to the established religious order. But this myth about the church being anti-science and keeping Europe in a 1,000-year-long dark age is a convenient myth that has been perpetrated for the past 250 years. It ultimately originated with modernity, and it is ultimately just that. It's a myth. It's a clever piece of propaganda, and it's a view of history which is skewed in a particular ideological direction, as with other earlier forms of historical account and every form of historical account. Just because people are modern doesn't mean they're any more objective than the people that went before, who believed different things. Another thing that often gets pinned on Christianity is support for slavery, and there were undoubtedly people in the South, in the American states, who used biblical verses, the fact that the Bible was written at a time when slavery was quite common, to take that as an endorsement of slavery. But there were others, such as Benjamin Lay and the Quakers, who actually abhorred slavery and had a scriptural basis for opposing slavery, and ultimately those religious people spearheaded the campaign to abolish the slave trade, which was ultimately successful. So it was thrilling to read about all these different chapters in history, the ups and the downs, and the kinds of really, really deep questions that were being considered by various Christian thinkers, and the kind of epic struggles to reshape the world that popped up again and again as the revolutionary force of Christianity worked its way through civilization, and continued to be a revolutionizing force for many, many centuries after it was first created. This belief system that seeks to turn the kingdoms of the world upside down and looks forward to the day when that process is utterly completed and the kingdom of God has been established on earth. Of course, this is only one side of the story. All of these positive things that came out of the legacy of Christianity, it's just one side of the story, and it ignores the sordid history of atrocities that have been committed in the name of Christ. The Crusades, the Inquisition, and so on. Pogroms, the works, colonization, all kinds of evil perpetrated in the name of God. And that's the darker side of Christian history. But there's one thing that made the empire building of the Christians and the kind of the conquest of the Christian powers so much different to any other forms of imperialism, and that is that there was almost like a remorse or a repentance for past evils after the fact, and a desire to make amends with those who had been wronged by the system, which we see even today. in Western societies, particularly those that were the byproduct of settlement by European powers. But this is something that is utterly unique in world civilization. The Huns certainly didn't apologize to Eastern Europe after they went through pillaging and destroying everything. And nor did any other of the empires that didn't have this Christian morality at their core. And so once again, the very fact that we are making these critiques of the empires and nations of the past that were Christian is very much itself symptomatic of Christian morality. So that's just an interesting point that Tom Holland made. Now I have to say the last bit of the book didn't interest me as much. It's nothing to do with the way that it was written. Tom Holland did a very good job of using very sophisticated language and engaging language throughout, very illustrative language throughout the book. But the thing that made the last bits dull was the subject matter, the modern world, people digging up rocks and people measuring things, and it's not really that inspiring next to the glamour of empires and churches and saints and the charisma of these great religious figures and the way that an entire civilization could be inspired by a vision. Of course, the modern world did have its visionaries, and Dominion goes into some of the ways that Christian norms in Western society began to fray as a result of the scientific revolution, and some of the consequences that had, as we not only questioned the scientific assumptions of the Bible, but also the moral assumptions. So Darwin, with his theory of evolution, disproved the 6,000 year long timeline for the Earth as set out if you take the Bible absolutely literally, in favor of evolution. But the evolutionary theory did something else as well. It painted a picture of human existence and natural law as a whole, which was all about survival of the fittest and only the strongest surviving, and how that is the way that things naturally were. And of course, when this took the expression of a moral philosophy, it had dire consequences for the human race. And in a similar vein, Nietzsche kind of goes in this direction after he proclaims the death of God. And with the rise of communism as well, we again see traditions arising in the West which perhaps superficially are inspired by the Christian worldview, the eschatological narrative of the clash of good and evil, the standing up for the oppressed. That's actually a load of rubbish, because the only thing that communism is about promoting is the supremacy of a singular party, and they just do things on behalf of the oppressed as a cover for their true agenda. And the 20th century is a testament to that true agenda and the lives that were claimed because of it. And again, we see here a departure from many of the norms that for centuries before we'd taken for granted about there being higher values beyond just material reality and the struggle between different social groups. We saw a departure from ideas such as freedom of conscience and the dignity of the individual as distinct from the collective, which ultimately found their root in Christianity in one form or another, perhaps also influenced by the classical Greek philosophers, but certainly exported through the medium of Christianity, which absorbed some of these earlier traditions as well, as well as building upon similar ideas in the Judaic kind of tradition. But one thing is really surprising, as highlighted by Dominion, and that is that classical liberalism is very much inspired by Christianity. Even though it's considered a secular humanist ideology. And I'm not talking about liberals of today. I'm talking about the liberals of 20 years ago and perhaps even further back than that. You're liberals who believe in civil and political rights, the right to free speech, the right to be free from political oppression, and having the state or some other body telling you what to think and what to say. The liberalism that was concerned with promoting, tolerance and equality and fraternity between people, rather than being divided into tribes and, failing to listen to the other side instead of engaging in dialogue and debate, which are staples of a democratic society. That's what liberalism used to represent once upon a time. That's what the progressive tradition used to represent once upon a time. And those proud traditions ultimately come from the norms that were established by Christianity. And that's something which Holland articulates quite clearly in this book and quite convincingly. He talks about Martin Luther King and the role that he played. That is a very obvious example of how Christian morality can motivate somebody to campaign for civil rights, for a better world for all people, in very much the liberal vein of what society should look like. And on the topic of secular humanism as well, even the sort of arguments that were levelled against the church by people such as Voltaire at the beginnings of the Age of Enlightenment are really just riffing off earlier criticisms that the Protestants made about the Catholic Church. And the Protestant critiques were very much rooted in a kind of Christian morality, and far from trying to reject Christianity and reject religion. What the Protestants were doing, issuing the same criticisms against the Catholic Church, was trying to restore Christianity and return to the true spirit of Christianity. The same spirit which we see paralleled so much in later modern ideologies that were concerned with making the world a better place. Not all ideologies, of course. The more deliberately atheistic of them, such as communism, were more of a mockery of Christianity than anything kind of organically stemming from it. And there's discussion at the very end of the book, the final chapter, about some of the contemporary social movements which have arisen since about 2017. And this is my other final criticism of Tom Holland's book. I think that he is far too charitable to these modern social movements. He sort of implies that they are the successors to the kind of liberal movements for social justice, such as are embodied by MLK and the work of Benjamin Lay, when in fact that's giving them far too much credit. But the social movements of today that are dominating the cultural narrative have much more in common with the communist movement of the 20th century and its deliberate mockery of God than anything from the liberal tradition. That would be my one major criticism. And if you analyse the movements of today closely, that becomes readily apparent. But so far as the kind of political ideas go that gave rise to the modern West as we know it today, even the secular West as we know it today, and more than that, the ideas that gave rise to the international rules-based order can be traced back to Christianity, ultimately. And this is something which is quite surprising to me, because by having what would have been a modern outlook 20 years ago, I've actually been more in the spirit of Christianity and Christ in my outlook than some of these evangelical fundamentalists who seem to be trying to revert much more to a pre-Christian outlook of just the strongest will survive and the prosperity gospel to back that all up, and God loves those who are already prosperous because the fact that they have so much is a sign of God's favor. But I go through some of these thoughts that I've had about Christianity in some of my earlier videos on my faith journey, so I won't go into that now. But yeah, anyway, Dominion is a very good book, and it'll definitely make you think. And what is really striking about it, it made me realize how so many of my core values are fundamentally Christian in origin, and also that this revolution that was caused by the teachings of Christ are so revolutionary that it's taken 2,000 years for it to work its way through civilization, and it's still going. It's still an agent of change, even today. Many of the aspects of the vision of the new heaven and new earth have not been realized yet. So it's still a belief system that has the potential to revolutionize society further. And this, even though the churches as institutions are on the decline, there's still people that are spiritual, and many of those spiritual people, I would hazard a guess, have many of the same moral assumptions that I do, because of the deep-seated, lasting legacy that Christianity has left behind in the West, and ultimately the rest of the world as well, which is sort of immersed in this international universal order. So yeah, a fascinating book, and very poignant, very impactful at this time in history when the West is losing many of its values and forgetting who they are, and forgetting what is important from our past, and what we can't afford to lose, because things will just go to hell without them. And this is a book that, if you're anything like me, it will leave you feeling a great sense of gratitude towards the traditions of the past, which have enshrined the value of human dignity and creating a world order based on compassion. A gratitude which I didn't have before, because I took so much of this for granted. And having so many of the values that we hold dear rooted in a myth, in a powerful mythological story, just strengthens them all the more. So as mainstream forms of a religion are on the decline, I'm not quite sure how we can preserve that. Well, I've got some ideas, but I'm not going to go into that now. But I think that it is important that we do preserve this myth of where we've come from, and the and how that informs our desire to build and maintain a world based on justice and righteousness. So yeah, if you want to have a thought-provoking read that takes you down some of these trains of thought, I would highly recommend Dominion. That's my book review. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed that, please leave your comments down below. Subscribe to this channel to support my work. You can also subscribe to my Odyssey. And yeah, I hope that you enjoyed that. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.